We are being recorded, and I am your moderator, Mark Van Name, pronouns he, him. I'm going to be introducing or letting our guests introduce themselves and then guiding us through questions. So without further ado, let's get to it. Julayne, would you like to start?
I can do that. My name is Julayne Hughes. I prefer she, her. I have been freelance editing and writing for over 25 years. I typically write speculative fiction, short stories, and I've been published in several anthologies and on podcasts and things like that. On the editing side, I've edited in several genres for many small publishers and a whole bunch of independent authors.
Margaret?
I'm Margaret Riley. I am the editor-in-chief for Changeling Press, and I'm also a submissions editor. And I am she, her, hey, you, whatever's handy.
Jim?
I'm Jim Stratton. He, written mainly short stories published in various periodicals. The current economic circumstances have prevented an anthology for me coming out from local press that has gone under.
And Beth?
I'm Beth Tanner, she, her, and I write speculative fiction of various flavors, and I live between DC and Baltimore.
And as I said, my name is Mark Van Name. I've published 5 novels, a few dozen short stories, and about 1,500 tech articles and 100 or so essays. So written all kinds of things, and I've edited or co-edited, I think, 4 anthologies. So before we get started on editing techniques, what I wanted to do is ask each of you, again, going through in alphabetical by last name order, to give us a quick overview of your normal writing process. You know, how many drafts, what do you handle without readers? Do you have beta readers? Just take a couple of minutes and walk us through so we can understand how you approach the task of writing. Julayne? You might be muted, Julayne.
Sorry about that. My typical writing process is pretty much, it depends. It depends on if I have an idea fully formed in my head already, or if I'm just kind of looking around for, I know there's an idea there, but I just have to scratch something down to see what can come of it later. So sometimes I can just write like I'm taking dictation. Other times I just write sloppy and fix it later. Since I'm doing short stories, I don't typically use beta readers, but I do have a few friends, editor friends and things that will help me edit before I send stuff off.
Margaret?
I'm on the receiving end of the send it stuff off, and so I'll be talking mainly about what I wish you'd done before you sent it to me.
Jim?
Yes. My process is fairly straightforward. I write. Actually, for a while there, before I retired, I would dictate stories to myself while I drove to work. I had about a 1-hour commute each way, which I found very helpful, although it resulted in some very odd kind of things in the in the language. So I had to do some pretty heavy editing, but I found it very helpful because it got words on the page, which for some people, and me at times, just getting the words on the page and not sweating over each sentence and so on can be very difficult.
Beth?
I'm with Julayne on the, it really depends. Many different assorted processes depending on what I'm writing, how fully formed the idea is, whether I'm trying to write to a deadline, how long the piece is, pretty much all of the things. And I do have a couple of really great critique groups, so I do get everything critiqued at least once, if not multiple times, before it goes out.
My process tends to be a little bit different for novels and short stories, but with novels, I all but in one case am an outliner, not a pantser. So I typically will do an outline, and then I will do a first draft and immediately go back and start on the second. I don't show my work to anybody until I send it to my editor, but I typically do 5 complete passes over a novel and 3 to 5 over any short story. So I'm a big believer in hard work makes better manuscripts. So let's dive now directly into the topic of the panel. So you've reached that magic moment. You have a first draft, which is, for those who aren't writers, a truly magic moment, because you have a thing now that you might be able to turn into something you really love. Maybe it already is. I'd like to each of you to talk a little bit about, what do you do next? How do you attack that process of, do you put it aside, you dive right in, what tools? So again, let's start with Julayne.
Typically, it's best to let your manuscript age for a while. That way, after some period of time, you can come back to it and look with fresh eyes at it. So that's going to help. Overall, I guess I would say to make your manuscript as clean as possible before you hire an editor. Yes, I said hire an editor. You can't afford not to have one. Some of the rest of my panel colleagues might have some more to say on that. But my biggest thing is just make that manuscript clean and declutter, declutter, declutter.
All right, Margaret?
One of the things I would really like to see, now I'm assuming that I'm getting a new manuscript from an unpublished or not previously published with our house, is to just take the time to run a spell check. It's amazing how many people just don't either turn off the little red lines or don't pay any attention to them. And granted, it is not going to catch synonyms, homonyms, completely wrong words that are spelled right. But if, for instance, you're doing a sci-fi with created names and your character's name is spelled 3 different ways or more, that can be really, that's one of those things that when you run spell check the first time you do it, you tell it to ignore all. If you see it again, then you've got it spelled more than one way. And just the simple little things that spell check will catch for you make your work look more professional. It's certainly not all inclusive, but it's a great start.
Jim?
Yeah, well, the first step for me is the easy one. I use my word processor spelling grammar check. It's not perfect, and I would sincerely hope anybody who's writing understands it'll pick up a lot of stuff, like you say, misspellings and things like that, some grammar things, but also understand it doesn't understand the concept of dialogue. It doesn't understand the concept of slang. So you need to be careful with that, but it will pick up some of the more obvious things. And then the next step is, if you don't have a reader, and I would highly recommend it, is you're going to have to start by going through it and reading it yourself. And the problem with that is, if you're like me, having written it and having spent a lot of time with that manuscript and the story, I tend to carry a copy around in my head. And I'm one of those people that I will read something on the page, and if it's something like this, I won't see some errors. I won't see where I left out, a verb or something. I just miss it. I just read right over it. Seem to be hung up. Can you hear me?
Yes.
You're still here.
Okay, because my video seemed,
There you go.
Here it is.
never mind. It didn't like that background either. So dig in, and this goes back to my comment earlier before we started, that if you're going to do that, you need to have a firm grasp on proper grammar. And even if you're going to write something that you don't anticipate is going to be in, high-sounding proper English, you can't write if you don't understand your tools. It's like if you're a carpenter or a bricklayer, you've got to know your tools to be successful. That doesn't mean that you necessarily have to follow everything. It may in fact be, for whatever it is you're writing, you may not want that. But if you don't understand the way it should be, you're not going to be successful in writing something that's coherent and is going to read well. And then, like I said, then you got to put it away. I have to put it away, and I mean for like a couple of months at least. I have to get it out of my head sufficiently so that I can look at it again, and I'm not glossing over the obvious mistakes that I've made, because I will have forgotten the specific language I'm using enough that I can hopefully pick that up. The final thing I would recommend is don't just read your manuscript in the original form. I've tried changing the type font to something really different, like a handwritten version that's reasonably legible. Blow the type font up so that the words are there in a 16 point or something like that. But change the appearance of what it is you're trying to read. Beyond that, you have to get it right, though. That's the key point. You can't submit something to a professional editor if it's full of grotty mistakes, because they do this for a living. And trust me, that stuff just jumps right off the page at them. And they don't like it. I mean, they don't mind the odd misspelling once a page or something like that, but when they keep bumping into it, it just bumps them right out of the story, is what I've been told by professional editors. They don't like it, and they don't like to see it.
That applies particularly to cover letters. If the cover letter is a disaster, who's going to read the book that follows it?
No.
So, I wanted to give Beth a chance to talk, but I also wanted to let the audience know that we do have a Q&A, and I'll be getting to that, but I wanted to get through a few more points with the panelists. But Beth, you haven't had a chance to talk yet.
Yeah, so I am a sort of a plantser in that I outline, but then I don't always stick to it. So one of the things that I always try to do, particularly for longer manuscripts, is reverse outline. So outline backwards based on what I've written, so that I now have an outline that is true to the actual story as opposed to the intended story. I really love the font change idea. I've used that one in the past. Reading aloud. And there's a discussion in the chat about using different reading aloud tools. For short fiction, I just read it to myself or read it into my phone. But something where you have to stumble over the words if they don't fit together correctly. To Jim's point about, oops, I left out the verb. You'll catch those when you read out loud in a way that you won't necessarily if you're just reading it on the page. One of the other things that I really like is a book called The 10% Solution by Ken Rand that talks about how to cull what Julayne affectionately referred to as the clutter out. So it's a great tool for just spotting those things that you always use. So I start about half the sentences in anything with just or so. And I know that those are my triggers and I have to go find them and search and replace throughout the manuscript. And then to one of Margaret's points, if you have words in your manuscript and it's distracting you with the little squiggly underline, you can also add them to the dictionary. And then if you misspell them, it will still catch it.
Okay, I'm probably the contrarian here on a lot of these points. I don't actually believe in hiring an editor. I believe it's my job to make it good enough to send it to a professional editor who's going to buy. So I'm not an editor hire person. I also don't generally believe in putting it aside. Sometimes I think that's necessary, but there is a concept of imaginative concentration, which is how deeply you are in the world that you're doing. And you can frequently tell writers that are skimming over their worlds by the lack of sensory information and things like that. I think that living in a world and putting it aside and coming back to it is a really hard challenge. And so for me, I find it better to stay inside the world. and then immediately keep working on the story. But I also believe that having a trusted beta reader can be a good thing, but only very near the end for me, because I feel like it's my problem to make that manuscript ready to go on my own. And so I typically don't show my work to anybody until I show it to the editor who's going to buy it. So a lot of the comments, I want to add a question that we didn't talk about, panel. I apologize for that, but we've talked a lot about the small things, fonts, reading back, word choices. What about the bigger stuff? We have, folks, we now have 7 questions in the Q&A, so we might turn to that a little bit earlier. But before we do, we've talked about the wording choice stuff. What about the structural stuff? You've left things out, the tension doesn't rise appropriately. How do each of you attack the structural aspects of your editing? Julayne? And you're muted. Julayne, you're muted. There you go.
There, geez. Computer doesn't want to do what I tell it to do. All right. Now, what was the question? Sorry. Yeah, as far as the larger structural stuff, what Beth talked about, the reverse outlining, that's a really good tool for doing that kind of thing. We actually had a panel yesterday on how to make the painful edits. And that's things like, eliminating characters. Are there whole sections of your book or story that you have to delete just because it doesn't belong in the story? It either drags it down, it slows the pacing, it is in the wrong place, whatever. There's any number of reasons why that might happen. One of the reasons that my thing is kind of declutter is because there's a lot of that kind of thing that you can really get rid of if you declutter. So, I edit for a lot of independent authors, and of course they all read each other. So after a while they start sounding like each other. So that's one thing that I try to look for is, oh, so-and-so uses that phrase all the time. You read him all the time, don't you? Oh, she uses that all the time. And I almost know who I'm editing without seeing the name, just because of some of the cluttery type of phrases that they use. So like, one of the things that really drives me nuts is a shiver went up my spine that had nothing to do with the cold. Every time I see that.
I think everybody has some pet phrases. That make a list of them, kill them all.
Yeah, they do. And there's a bunch of others. I'll let the rest of you go because I know that we got some other questions we got to ask. I could go on and on, but I won't.
Margaret, would you like to talk to the structural stuff?
One of the things that you need to remember is you don't come with the book. So if I have to ask you questions about it, then you left something important out. I shouldn't be asking you to explain things at this point. And that's really easy to do, especially if you've got heavy world building, to just kind of skip over some things because you already know them. One of my early editors told me the author doesn't come packaged with the book. Make sure it's going to stand on its own without you having to go back and explain. And incidentally, when you said something about hiring versus not hiring, I assume hiring has to do with if you're going to be self-publishing as opposed to submitting it to a publisher. I certainly think if you're going to be self-publishing, you should be hiring an editor.
Jim?
Yeah, a good friend who was also a writer years ago taught me one rule, one mantra: kill your babies. Most authors, when they write it, it's pearls of wisdom. It's great moving drama or whatever, and you need to understand that probably it's okay, but not everybody is going to be enthralled with it. The other thing I do structurally is as I go through a manuscript, I'm looking for probably descriptives. And what can I eliminate? Most people have fairly good imaginations. You don't have to get into a lot of discussion if someone is riding a horse. Most people understand what's involved, more or less, riding a horse. And I've read novels and stories where, you know, the hero climbs up on his, you know, his war horse, and you go off on a tear on how many hands and the you know, the saddle and all of that stuff. And it's just like, no, we don't need to know that. And you just need to figure it out. What do your readers absolutely positively need to know? And I would strongly recommend that when you start off, give them as little as you can, and then bring it up as you move along. But you're going to lose a reader fairly quickly if they get hung up on this long discussion of the world and the economy, culture, and so on and so forth. That can come later. Just get them in and get them going, get them reading, and then you can throw things in.
I'm sorry. One of the things I like to tell my authors is don't write like a computer programmer. Write like an author to a reader. So, and I get a lot of computer programmers who want to have visions of finishing their novels, and that's wonderful. But no, you don't have to tell every single little movement like your reader's a computer.
No, although you may need to know for yourself what all those pieces are.
Battle scenes especially, they don't need to know where your foot is and when your arm is, and they'll figure it out.
Beth, structural stuff.
Structural stuff is one of my, I say, pet peeve weak spots. So that's again why reverse outlining really works for me, is I can, as I'm going back through, and you discover in chapter 13 that, hey, you know, Bob is carrying a sword. Perhaps I should give Bob the sword sometime sooner than chapter 13 when it mysteriously appears. So I try to do a lot of the big structural stuff in that reverse outline pass, either by leaving myself notes in the Scrivener or putting sticky notes on the paper manuscript or however, whatever I'm reading in. And I'm a big, sorry trees, I'm a big print it out and read it on paper, because that again also gives me the different sort of perspective on it. But I will sticky note the heck out of it. I'll draw a little sort of mind map flow charts on the back of where things need to be reinserted or inserted for the first time or taken out to make that through line work. And it might mean that there's a couple of different lines of through line, one for particular character arcs, one for the sort of narrative arc, depending on how complicated the piece is.
Well, as an example, in the one you just used, someone's wearing a sword. You don't have to spend a lot of time in it, but when they go to sit down, what if the sword actually, you know, jabs them in the ankle or something? That's all you need to say. Oh, take that off.
He buckled on his sword belt and wandered off.
Yeah, done.
So I'll say for the structural stuff, in my case, outlining is definitely part of my approach to it, but also I try to sort of draw the arcs of the characters and of the story. And if I can't, as I read the book a second time, see a clear progression, if the scenes aren't building well, then I go back and study it and add or move or things like that. I also wanted to mention, and this is probably a disclaimer I should have put at the beginning, on any writing panel, there are no absolute rules. And so I would encourage everybody who's joined us on the panel or watching it to remember that for any rule any of us give, you'll find extremely successful writers who break it all the time. For example, in the Don't Tell Us All the Details, Neil Stephenson novels are, I would argue, both frequently very entertaining, bestsellers, and absolutely full of exposition on every detail that captures his imagination. A lot of people prefer not to do that. I'm certainly in the camp that prefers not to do that. There's a saying, don't make the reader suffer for your research. But I do think that, you know, find your own path is going to be really important. Let's do one more general pass through, and then I want to get to the questions in the Q&A. So I just, pet peeves. what are the things that you really particularly try to catch as you're editing your work, or in Margaret's case, other people's work? Julayne?
Well, one of the ones of my pet peeves I've already mentioned about the shiver going up your spine that has nothing to do with the cold. Somebody mentioned in the chat room, letting go of a breath that he hadn't known he was holding. So that drives me nuts too. But there are some simpler words that really annoy me, like walking, 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 walking. Now, how many times can I see walking in the course of 2 pages? Drives me absolutely nuts. So just some of the very simple words that you just kind of go past tend to be my pet peeves. I will sometimes just highlight each one of those repeated words and just put something else, something else, something else. There are some of my poor authors who can't stand seeing my little something else. Oh no, not again, really? So, but that just really drives me nuts. All those walking, 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 and continued drives me bananas too. So and so, such and such, he continued. Well, really? All right. I guess that'll do for now.
Margaret?
There are a couple of words that really don't mean what people think they mean. And just using them pulls. And of course, now I'm going to draw an absolute blank as to what I was going to say. But I have a list of hit words. Suddenly, just, you mentioned those. That. You do not need the word that in every other sentence. Of. People put of in weird places where it has no reason to be there. Be conscious of your sentence structure. If every other word or every other sentence, I mean, is a fragment, you probably need some conjunctivitis in there somewhere. I like sentence fragments. I write a lot of them personally, but occasionally you need some full sentences. And the other word I really wanted to mention is going to come back to me later. I'm sorry. It is run off and hit. It's a mouse under the stove.
Jim?
Yes, I would go with 2 pet peeves. One is dialogue, and Margaret, I think you touched on it. Saying "he said" is probably quite enough for most people. You don't have "he shouted," "he sternly instructed," and I've gone through where it's just they're looking for word salad type of things, and you don't need it. Most readers, if they've done any amount of reading, they don't even really see when it says "he said." They just boom, that's just a cue of someone is speaking. That's all they need to know, and it shouldn't get hung up on that. The other thing that bothers me is point of view, and I have read some stories, some by very famous authors, where they like to bounce their point of view around, and if you're not following closely, you can get lost on who's saying what and what is actually going on. And my process is such that if I have to change point of view, and even if I'm right in the middle of something, is I will get clear break in the story, and so that structurally someone reading along will understand, all right, this is a change. Some people just don't believe in it. Figure you'll figure it out. Thanks,
Beth.
As I mentioned when we were in the green room, I am somewhat of a person who likes their grammar done correctly, and I wanted to come back to something I think that you said, Mark, about no absolutes. There are no rules, and you can break the rules successfully, but I think it's important to know the rules first. And so my analogy is usually like making a recipe for the first time. The first time, you probably try to follow the recipe pretty accurately so that you know, okay, I need to cook this how long and add these seasonings then, and when do I put the wet and the dry ingredients in, or whatever the recipe is for. And then you start fiddling with it. But you don't start fiddling with it until you've got the sort of baseline down. And it feels to me a lot of times like people, and I don't know if it's, too much email and texting or just people who don't care, I see it unfortunately a lot in people who self-publish, that they have not edited for grammar at all, and that will throw me right out.
Thanks. And, you know, for myself, my pet peeves tend to be like everybody. I have a set of words I overuse. I toss them in, and then I need to go. I keep a list, and then I don't worry about it as I'm writing it. I go back through and fix them. And I think everybody I know has those words that are too much. We're at just past the half-hour mark, and we have 8 questions. So I'm going to start going through some of the Q&A, and I'll toss it out to the panel to talk about. The first one is a pretty straightforward one from Craig and Shelton, and asked, please clarify for the audience the difference between a copy editor and a content editor, and whether you recommend hiring both. So Beth, you want to take that?
Sure. I think this actually ties a little bit into the next question from Jamie, which is about self-publishing strategies. I typically do not hire editors, but I also am a pretty retentive editor myself, and I'm pretty capable of editing my own work to the standard for submission, at least. But I'm not looking for self-publishing. I'm sending these to traditional markets or short fiction markets where I'm partnering with the editor there to do a little bit of revision. But that my manuscripts are pretty clean when they leave my shop.
So to Craigan's question, would someone like to explain the difference between a copy editor and a content editor?
I think I can do that quite well.
Sure.
Since we use both. My copy editors, first we use a proofreader. Now we're talking about a submission that has been through edits. After edits, it goes through a proofreader to check for typos, a copy editor who is looking for not only typos that the proofreader and editor miss, but repetitive phrasing, missing words, things that just haven't been caught to this point. The editor is going for content. The copy editor is going for technical things. An editor is generally looking at your plot, your characterization, whereas your copy editor or line editor is generally looking for fourth limbs and repetitive phrasing and formatting issues that have happened between edits and production.
Yeah, and I would also, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I would also say that the copy editor, if you're submitting to a professional house, they have a house style. They have opinions on compound words, for example, and so the copy editor will flag where you are not coming in with house style.
Don't most houses, though, have a style manual that they will share with you, and you can review, so you'll pick that stuff up before you know, at some point along the line. But I should say,
we certainly do, but that we can't force authors to read it.
yeah.
So Jamie Lennon asked, and Beth alluded to, what particular changes to these strategies should be made if the story is not being pitched to an editor, but is instead being commercially self-published? I'm not someone who self-publishes at all, so I'm going to stay out of this one. Would somebody who does self-publish, or those who do, like to speak to this?
Well, the independent authors that I tend to edit typically self-publish. So I guess that's one of the reasons why at the very beginning I'm like, you must hire an editor, particularly if you're going to commercially self-publish, because you are not sending it to a house where it's going to go through their slew of editors. Instead, it stops with you. Really?
Isn't that your job?
Yeah, exactly. So, however, having said that, before you hire your editor, you want to do all these things that we talked about. So whether you're going to be pitching it to a one of the big 5 publishers or a magazine, or whether you're going to self-publish, all these things are still true for no matter which direction you go. Because whatever kind of editor you end up sending it to, they'll want as clean a copy as possible.
Anyone else want to comment on that question? Okay, Bob Konevsky asked, is putting it aside valuable for things other than mechanics like misspellings? What about things that were clear in your head that you forgot to make clear to the reader? Would folks like to comment on that?
I'll chime in on that one. I would say absolutely yes. Because then hopefully by the time you've put it away and come back to it and you read it with fresh eyes, you'll see those things, the structural things, the fact that Bob had, you know, blue eyes on page 1 and brown eyes on page 3, the fact that, you know, somebody changed gender or changed name, or not in the course of the story, but just by accident. Like, was there a Matilda before page 35? I don't think there was.
Or if you really want to get bombed, is if your hero has, you know, a broadsword strapped across his back, and then about halfway through it becomes a scimitar or something. Oh, you will get so shouted out. You know, those kind. There are people out there that's all they live for. That they, you know, they're very, very, very well educated in certain specific things, firearms in particular, and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I would add that if you do put your work aside and come back to it, the most important thing you can do is try to read it like a reader. Try to imagine somebody said, hey, here's a story or a novel that I really liked, and try and experience it that way. And if as a reader you're not very happy, that's a good sign that you have some big work to do. We have a question from Andrew Cox. Does the panel prefer to use beta readers only when the draft manuscript is complete, or while you're still writing, bouncing parts of the manuscript off the readers? Anybody care to?
I think that really depends on the author, because I know authors who do both. There are some who will not show it to a beta reader until they have it as good as they can make it. There are others who will just, here, can you take a look at this chapter and see if I'm going in the right direction? So really it just depends on the author, on the kind of thing you're writing, on what you want to do with it. So really it's just up to you. There's not really one blanket answer for that.
I think the thing to keep in mind is that unless you're an experienced professional, yes, you should have a beta reader. I would recommend something like that so that you have eyes on it from fellow writers who can, you know, they're gonna tell you, and not your mom or your brother or something like that who's only gonna, you know, give you these little softball niceties. You need, and I firmly believe that it's been very helpful for the years.
I share things both unfinished and finished, and it just depends on where I'm struggling. If I can't get something to come together, another set of eyes or another couple sets of eyes will help.
I think too, there's a difference between what you share and who you share it with, in that if it's a work in progress that you're having structural problems with, that probably is going to be more help sharing it with a critique partner. In other words, another writer who you work with back and forth. Whereas a beta reader is a reader, somebody who would otherwise be buying your book that's going to look at it as a complete finished product.
Yeah, I would say as somebody who doesn't practice this, on the rare times when I have shown work to anyone else, to me the most valuable thing was for them to actually just be a reader, like Margaret just said, to just experience the book. Did they enjoy it? Did it, you know, what parts did they not enjoy? Not trying to tell you how to fix it so much as telling their reaction to it just as a reader. So Andy Popovich asked, what practical tools do you use for the big structural changes? Anybody care to talk to tools for structural work?
Sure.
All right.
I am a big fan of the Scrivener corkboard view for things where I'm working in Scrivener, but that can easily be replicated by 3x5 cards on the dining room table to get the kinds of changes organized and make sure that I haven't like left Kneff off stage for 25 minutes because other things were going on, or, you know, changed point of view randomly in the middle of something. So yeah, some color-coded 3x5 cards with like a colored swipe on the corner with a marker. Does the same thing as Scrivener does. Sticky note Kanban board on the wall works. Anything that you can, you know, those terrible murder maps that they do on crime shows with the strings and the pictures and stuff, if you want to go that far. But anything, for me, also spreadsheets. I'm a huge spreadsheet person for things like, okay, how long has it been since Kenneth was on, you know, on stage? How long has it been since we were in somebody's point of view? Oh, look, we teleported from point A to point B overnight. What happened? And so looking like those kinds of structural problems.
We do a lot of serials, and you may have characters that each book may only be 100, 150 pages, but if there are 15 of them, you need to be able to go back and figure out if Rachel's eyes were blue in book 1, when she reappears with her own book in book 15, they can't turn green. So spreadsheets are an awesome way to keep track of that. Anybody, I'm sure here we're going to have some old D&Ders, character record sheets for each character in a major novel, or particularly in a series or serial where you're going to have reoccurring characters. They are awesome.
We talked about this a little bit in the panel on Friday on tools, but you can also set up free Wikipedia style things, which are great for keeping track of all the things in the series Bible.
There's a tool out there called Archivos that does that kind of thing too. You can archivos.com. You can just basically build a whole world there and put all your character sketches in there, put your destination sketch, all your geography. You can just, so that's just one tool that I know is out there for being able to keep track of things like that.
Jim, do you have any tools?
Just my own, what's in my own head, which is why I put it away for a while before I go back. Because yes, I will pick up those kind of discontinuities that way if I'm moving along. I won't pick it up on an immediate reread in most cases.
Yeah, my tools tend to all be revolving around Word files or paper notes, but I do believe in updating the outline as I go, trying to keep notes there. And I'm writing a very long book series that continues and has an overarching plot arc. I'm 5 books into it. And so for that, I actually have a concordance that friends help put together so that I can look up what gender was the kid of the captain who named the planet in book 1 for a reference in book 4, which is a mistake I got wrong. A mistake I made once, so easy to do. Jennifer Garcia asked, any advice for someone considering writing a nonfiction book? I can speak to this slightly. I've published a few nonfiction books, and there I find that having strong agreement with your editor on what the book is going to be is really important, unless you're a very big name. And outlining, I think, is key, and trying to make sure that each chapter has something to say. Too many nonfiction books, to me, take too long to build up to any kind of meat. Does anybody else want to comment on nonfiction books?
As an attorney, I have drafted legal pleadings and briefs and so on and so forth, which I think fall into that category. And that's where your shrunken white better be dead on. I think in terms of if you're doing nonfiction and it's supposed to be some sort of authoritative text, you almost, at least as you're writing it, you better have your citations to where you're getting it and why what you're saying is correct. Because again, there are people out there who are experts potentially on your topic who are not going to give you any slack whatsoever if you get it wrong.
And that's a whole other editing role, is the fact checking.
Yeah, and you can certainly find experts in areas who are willing to talk to you. There's no substitute for interviewing people who like to talk about the areas of expertise for them and give them credit in your work and thank them.
That's
Bob,
very true in fiction as well, particularly anything sci-fi. You're still going to need to do the same kind of fact research.
absolutely.
Yeah, I write some Oriental fantasies, and I have books and books and books over there on my bookshelf, both historical things and novels written by Japanese authors. Yeah, you got to get it right, and you've got to do the research. You've got to, you have to know what is the way things were if you're going to do that.
We have 6 questions still to go, so I'm going to ask if any individual wants to comment. Here's one that's probably a straightforward one. Bob Konevsky asked, where do you stand on the repetition of he said versus he groaned, he muttered, etc.? Anybody?
Kill them all.
Yes, kill your babies. I usually try not to get into those kinds of tags, except for if you're in a dialogue, every couple of sentences along, people will keep track of it. But I mean, after a while, they'll lose track of who spoke last. But no, you don't need a lot of that. People who read will figure it out if they're following.
We only have a couple minutes left, so just real quickly, anybody want to recommend really good grammar or spell check apps? I'll say that what comes with Word, I work in Word, is really solid. Others?
I agree.
Grammarly is a good one. And one that I like to use is editminion.com.
Anybody have good sites for finding proofreaders, copy editors, content editors? Ronald Jones asked to go to SIFA. What should we do? And Betsy Marks asked a similar question. How does one find an editor to hire and prep for selling a work? Anybody?
Would ask around. I think that you could probably find some on, certainly on Twitter and on like Query Shark or one of those, I think. And yeah, organizations like BizFist are coming to things like this and talking to people who are doing editing, or asking somebody you like who did their editing.
Folks,
I would recommend you look into writers groups, maybe join one. But when you go in, the thing you need to be careful about is judging the level of experience of the people there. You're not going to learn a lot if you're up here and they're down here.
so
Same
folks,
if they're way up here and you're down here. They're not going to put up with you.
we're at less than 2 minutes to go, so I'm sorry. There are still a few open questions we didn't get to, but yeah, I hope you can catch up with most of the panelists in Discord afterwards or around the virtual convention in Discord. We have 1 minute here. Anybody, just quickly, where can people reach you? You can put it in the chat window so folks can see, or say it. I'm at markvanname.com. Anybody else?
You'll find my contact information on the participant list, I believe.
You can find me at julayne.net, Julayne.net, and I'm on Facebook too.
I'm at BT_musings on Twitter.
changelingpress.com, and I also just put up a link for Savvy Authors Guild, which is a good resource for unpublished and authors who are looking for resources.
All right, we're almost out of time. Thank you to all my fellow panelists. Thank you to all the participants. You should be finding this online within a month. And thank you to the tech team that's done so much work to make this happen. We will be leaving now. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mark.
Have a good panel or a good con, folks. Better one next year,
You
hopefully.
too. Yes.
Thanks.